I feel really good. Thank you for having me on. First off, I appreciate the opportunity. But look, I didn't reach my conclusion lightly. But by the time I made the decision, seeing how we got into this war and seeing the path that we're going down now, I knew that I was doing the right thing.
All right, welcome back to the channel. I'm honestly really glad you clicked on this video because what we're about to get into isn't just another headline. It's one of those rare conversations that actually feels significant and long overdue. So let me set the scene for you properly. You've got a man who was handpicked to take charge of the National Counterterrorism Center, someone trusted at the highest level. Suddenly stepping away from that role and then going public with a statement that flips the entire narrative on its head. He's saying the war never truly had a solid justification and that the United States ended up being drawn into it because of the influence and priorities of foreign allies. And just when you think that alone is explosive, the situation escalates even further because the very president who originally gave him that position responds not with policy or facts, but with a deeply personal remark involving his late wife. Now here is where it gets really interesting because Joe Kent doesn't react the way most people would. He doesn't get defensive or emotional. Instead, he sits down with Piers Morgan and calmly starts unpacking everything piece by piece, the intelligence behind the decisions, the pressure from inside the system. The way certain narratives kept reinforcing themselves, all of it delivered with a level of composure that you only see in someone who feels like they have absolutely nothing left holding them back. And trust me, you are going to want to stick with this all the way to the end because it doesn't peak early, it builds, and it gets heavier and more intense the deeper you go. The most powerful moments are definitely still ahead, but before we dive straight into it, take a second and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. It always amazes me how global this community is, people tuning in from completely different corners of the world. Go ahead and say hi, mention your city or your country. We genuinely go through all of them. All right, with that said, let's jump right into this.
There was no real sign that was given either to the American public or even internally that these talks were breaking down. There were talks about this deal. There were talks about getting Iran to back off of the nuclear enrichment. These talks have been going on for quite some time, right? So now there was no indication given to the American people or anybody else that these talks had somehow broken down to a point that now we had to go to war. That's the first thing. The second thing is that there was no evidence that there was any kind of threat towards some immediate action that was going to happen against America or its allies from Iran. So these are two things that did not happen. So what you're saying about all of this stuff is absolutely true and verifiable fact. Like, I'm not arguing that at all.
You just stated is categorically false.
The fundamental point that I'm making is this: that there was no real reason given to the American public for us to have gone into this war in the way that we have. And now, obviously, things have changed because now we are in this war. And I think that a lot of people want to kind of like next day quarterback this and give a lot of reasons as to why we should be there now that we're already there. And I totally understand that, right? And I totally understand and respect the sacrifice of our troops that have given their lives to this war and to this country. Would never denigrate that for a single solitary second. The reason I am in opposition to this, and the reason that I continue to be in opposition to this, is because when we are going to put American troops in harm's way, and we have already sacrificed the lives of way too many American troops for my liking, and I do believe that there will be more. We owe the American people and we owe our troops an ironclad, rock-solid reason to put them
I can
in
get it if you'd stop talking. I can get it if you'd stop talking.
I'm afraid, guys, we've run out of time. I really appreciate the debate. We could talk for a lot longer, but I appreciate you both joining me. Thank you both very much.
Thanks, Piers.
Thank you, Piers.
Well, Joe Kent is a Gold Star husband, a retired Green Beret, and a veteran of 11 combat tours across 20 years service in the US Army. President Trump appointed him to the role of Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, a position from which he resigned last week. Iran posed no imminent threat to our nation, he said in his statement. It's clear that we started this war due to pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. And I'm pleased to say that Joe Kent joins me now. Joe Kent, I'm just wondering, a week ago your life was very, very different to what it is today. You've been through what I would call the mincer since you went public. You're a man used to very difficult situations. How are you feeling about how this week has gone for you?
I feel really good. Thank you for having me on. First off, I appreciate the opportunity. But look, I didn't reach my conclusion lightly. But by the time I made the decision, seeing how we got into this war and seeing the path that we're going down now, I knew that I was doing the right thing, and I still feel the same way today. So my main goal is to hopefully change the dialogue on how we're looking at things in Iran, and hopefully give the president some opportunity to get us out of this conflict.
This sort of central charge that there was no imminent threat. You know, we've heard people like Lindsey Graham and others saying they were 2 weeks away from doing something, which seems ridiculous. You were in the perfect position to know what the actual real threat was. How would you assess it?
This is the part that really sticks with me every time I go back and watch it. You've got Rob Smith sitting there, a combat veteran, someone who didn't just talk about war but actually lived through it, wore the uniform, and experienced it firsthand, saying something that cuts straight through all the noise. He looks directly at the issue and says the American public was never truly given a clear and honest reason for why this war even happened. And what makes that statement land so heavily is the fact that he is not coming at this from a typical angle. He is not a political pundit trying to score points, and he is not an anti-war voice building an audience online. This is someone who has seen the reality of conflict up close, someone who understands the real cost when decisions made in offices turn into consequences on the battlefield. That is exactly why his words carry so much weight and feel impossible to ignore. You have to keep in mind something very basic here. When a nation decides to go to war, there is a responsibility that comes with that decision. The people deserve a clear explanation. They deserve to understand the reason, to see the evidence, to hear what the actual threat is, what happens if nothing is done, and what the plan looks like moving forward. That is not a high bar, that is the bare minimum that has always been expected. And what Rob is saying, very directly, is that this standard was not met in this case, not even remotely. But here is the detail that often gets misunderstood and really matters. He is not criticizing the soldiers who served. In fact, he makes it clear that he would never diminish their sacrifice for even a moment. What he is doing instead is drawing a sharp line between those who made the decisions and those who carried them out. He is pointing out that the failure lies with leadership, not with the individuals who were sent to fight. That distinction is huge, and it is something people often blur when they should not. When he talks about the idea that troops are owed a completely solid and unquestionable reason before being sent into conflict, that is not him being dramatic. That is a long-established expectation tied to every major military action in modern history. You present the case openly, you lay out the intelligence, and you explain the strategy. The fact that this process appears to have fallen short, and that it is being highlighted by a conservative veteran of the Iraq War, says a lot about how serious this situation really is. And then just as this segment is wrapping up, Piers Morgan shifts the conversation and asks Joe Kent to evaluate how real the threat actually was. Now this is where things get even more interesting, because Joe Kent is not just offering opinions from the sidelines. He was placed in charge of national counterterrorism by the administration itself, which means he has direct insight into the kind of information most people never see. So when that question is put to him, you can already sense that whatever answer is coming next is probably not going to sit comfortably with those who supported the war.
The only imminent threat was of Israel attacking Iran and then Iran retaliating against our bases in the region because the Iranians knew that the Israelis couldn't accomplish this military objective they have of regime change without our support. So we knew that was going to happen. That was the only imminent threat. Once President Trump came into office in 2025, the Iranians closely observed a escalation ladder. By that, I mean, prior to President Trump coming back into office, the Iranian proxies in the region had attacked our troops hundreds of times throughout the region after October 7th. Once Trump came back in, the Iranians deliberately stopped their proxies from attacking our troops, knowing that President Trump wanted to get to the negotiating table. He did just that with Steve Witkoff and others. When the 12-day war was launched, the Iranians didn't attack us. They made sure their proxies didn't attack our forces in the region. They didn't actually take a strike against us until we hit the nuclear facilities. And then they launched an equal amount of missiles that we dropped on bombs, and they dropped on their nuclear facilities. And then they eagerly got back to the negotiating table with us. So there actually was no threat emanating directly from Iran. They had the capability to pose a threat to us, but so do many nations. But we did not have any intelligence to indicate that they were on the cusp of attacking us. The only real threat was from Israel forcing our hand.
And notwithstanding the fact that Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, publicly stated that actually America launched a preemptive attack because Israel, he didn't name the country, but it's obvious he was talking about, had indicated they were going to attack Iran and therefore there would be a response and America would have to get involved. They then tried to rein that back. But he was on the record as basically saying, we did this because of Israel's decision to attack. You, with your criticism, have now been accused by Mitch McConnell of being anti-Semitic. You've had Matt Brooks, the president of the Republican Jewish Coalition, saying that your appearance on Tucker Carlson's podcast was part of an ongoing problem, so inferring the same. How do you respond to that charge that you're anti-Semitic?
So in my criticism of really our policy, the American policy towards Israel, I've never mentioned the religion of the people of the state of Israel. My issue is the fact that we have a foreign government that is dictating our policy in the Middle East, and in particular dictating when and how we go to war. That's my main issue. Look, these guys are going to throw out the anti-Semitic claim because they want people debating that, and they also want people to cower because no one wants to be called anti-Semitic. They're doing that because they don't want to discuss the fundamental issue, which is exactly what Secretary Rubio said, that we were forced into this war because we knew that the Israelis were going to attack, which would set off a series of reactions from the Iranians. So that's why we went ahead and conducted the attack, because our hand was forced by the Israelis. That's what Mitch McConnell, Lindsey Graham, and all the neoconservatives don't want to address. And that's the main issue here that we should be discussing.
Of course, at the same time, it's been pretty obvious to people, I think, that from what Antony Blinken said, that Israel had tried this before. They tried to tell President Obama and President Biden, we're going to attack. Are you with us? We're going to attack Iran. Both times the answer came back no. And on both occasions, Israel didn't attack. I thought that was very significant.
And I'm sure the Israelis told the Trump administration this in an effort to get them to be stronger than the Biden administration and than the Obama administration.
This is the turning point right here, because what Joe Kent says in this moment does not just challenge the narrative. It quietly pulls the entire foundation out from under the justification that was used to start this war. Notice how precise he is with his words. He is not claiming that Iran was harmless or fully cooperative, and he is not suggesting there were no concerns at all. Instead, he narrows it down with incredible clarity and explains that the only immediate risk on the table was the chance that an allied nation might take action on its own and pull the United States into the fallout. That is a completely different scenario from the idea that Iran was about to directly strike America, and this is where it really makes you stop and think, because Joe does not stop there. He goes on to describe how, after the administration returned to power, Iran's regional proxies actually paused their attacks on American forces. Not by accident, but intentionally, because they were trying to move toward negotiations. He even points out that the only time a response was launched was after nuclear facilities were targeted, and even then it was proportional. Followed almost immediately by a return to diplomatic talks. That kind of behavior does not line up with a country preparing to launch an imminent hamla on the United States. It looks far more like a government attempting to keep things from spiraling out of control. So when Joe clearly states that there was no intelligence suggesting they were on the verge of attacking America, that should have made everyone sit up and pay attention. Because this is not coming from a random voice or a political critic. This is coming from the person whose role was to oversee and understand exactly that kind of threat information at the highest level. Then Piers Morgan brings another critical detail into the conversation by referencing what the Secretary of State publicly admitted. That the United States acted preemptively because an ally had indicated it was going to move forward regardless. There were attempts to soften that statement afterward, but once something like that is said openly, it cannot simply be undone, especially when it comes from the country's top diplomat. And what makes it even more serious is that this reasoning has nothing to do with a direct and immediate danger to American citizens. That is not a minor detail, that is the core argument behind the entire conflict starting to break apart in real time. Joe's reaction to being labeled anti-Semitic for raising these points is another moment that deserves attention because he handles it directly and calmly. He makes it clear that he never brought religion into the discussion at any point. His concern is about the level of influence a foreign government may have over decisions that lead America into war. And he also points out something important, that this kind of accusation often gets used as a way to derail the conversation. Because once people start arguing over labels instead of focusing on policy, the real issue quietly gets pushed aside without ever being properly addressed.
What I pointed out in my resignation letter is that there was an echo chamber that was created around President Trump by key Israeli government officials and then media talking heads, basically saying that this was the only time for us to take down the regime. They also moved the red line in a very clever way. President Trump had always said that Iran can't have a nuclear weapon. Well, the Iranian regime under the previous supreme leader basically agreed, and they had a fatwa that made a prohibition on Iran developing a nuclear weapon. So the Israelis came in with the goal of moving that red line because basically the Iranians said they wanted to continue to have the ability to enrich. And that kind of got us into this conundrum. But then in January, when the Iranians were feeling the weight of the economic sanctions that President Trump had put on them, they took to the streets. Again, the Israeli lobby came back. The key Israeli officials came back and said, now is the prime time to strike. If you strike, there's a clear path to victory. The regime will simply just fall. And so basically, through those series of events, we were led to believe that there was a clear path to victory. But in order for the Israelis to get what they wanted, they went ahead and they said that we, the Israelis, were going to attack, again, forcing our hand and dragging us into this war.
What are your feelings about President Trump? He said since you resigned, he's not a fan. He thinks you're weak on security, which does beg the question, well, why did he make you what he made you in the first place? What do you feel about his response since you resigned?
I understood that when I left, especially in the manner that I chose to leave very publicly, that he was going to have to say something. Look, I don't take any of this personally. What I want President Trump to do is to realize that the initial policy that he had towards Iran, especially in his first administration, when he utilized a series of key strikes against Iranian terrorists like Qasem Soleimani and Abu Mahdi Mohandas, but then he leveraged the economic weight of America with max pressure sanctions. He had Iran contained. He knew that the Iranians knew that he meant business because of what he did to Qasem Soleimani, who basically walked all over Obama, walked all over George Bush. President Trump had them basically exactly where we needed them, where they were ready to get to the negotiating table. And President Trump was on the cusp of having a historic peace that I believe is still obtainable. But first and foremost, what President Trump has to do is reset and rethink our relationship with Israel. We cannot have Israel in the driver's seat of our foreign policy as it's been in the Middle East for my entire lifetime.
You say it's not personal, but he's got quite personal with you. And for context, some viewers may not be aware of this, but your first wife, Shannon, was a US Navy technician who was killed in Syria in 2019 in a suicide bombing, leaving behind your two children. You married your current wife, Heather, in August 2023, more than 4 years later. Donald Trump said this week about this.
Look, I'm not a fan of the guy. He was a man that I met at Dover. He came and his wife was killed. He remarried fairly quickly. His wife was killed.
I mean, that was a nasty dig. You married very quickly. You know, whatever he was trying to infer, it wasn't pleasant. That is personal, isn't it? Did that offend you? That hurt you?
I mean, of course, it's personal. It's not pleasant to hear that the president speak in that manner. But look, again, the stakes are really high, Piers. I mean, my late wife was killed in one of these Middle Eastern wars that we shouldn't have been in the first place. Hundreds of my friends were killed in these wars as well. My entire generation, basically after 9/11, spent our adult lives in war.
This is the point where everything stops feeling like a distant political debate and starts hitting on a deeply personal level, because up until now the discussion has been centered around strategy, intelligence reports, international influence, and policy breakdowns, all of which are incredibly important, but then Joe shifts the focus in a way that cuts straight through all of that. He starts describing what it was like being inside an echo chamber, where key figures in government and major media voices are all surrounding a leader with the same message. Telling him this is the perfect moment, this is the chance to act, that success is practically guaranteed, and the opposing regime will collapse without much resistance. And when you really think about it, that kind of environment is incredibly risky. We have seen this pattern play out again and again throughout modern history, especially in some of the biggest foreign policy failures of the last century, where leaders are cut off from opposing viewpoints, where no one challenges the dominant narrative, and where confidence replaces caution. Joe is not speculating here. He is speaking from direct experience within that system, explaining exactly what he witnessed. Then he makes a statement that is simple but powerful, saying that no foreign government should ever be steering the direction of American foreign policy. That is not an attack on any nation. It is a fundamental principle of sovereignty that every country in the world operates by, the idea that your decisions, especially ones involving war, must remain your own. The fact that a former senior official even feels the need to say that out loud is striking on its own. But then the conversation takes a turn that feels even more significant than any policy discussion, because Piers brings up Shannon, Joe's late wife. Someone who served her country and lost her life overseas, and then plays a clip of the president making a remark about how quickly Joe remarried after her passing. It is important to understand that Joe did not introduce this topic. He did not try to make things personal, yet when he responds, he does it with a level of composure and respect that most people would struggle to maintain. He acknowledges that yes, it is personal and not something anyone enjoys hearing, but instead of staying there, he immediately redirects the focus to what truly matters, the countless friends he lost. The reality that an entire generation came of age with war shaping their lives. That kind of response tells you everything about his intentions. This is not about gaining attention or building a political profile. This is coming from someone who has experienced real loss, who has buried people close to him, and who now, with access to the kind of intelligence very few ever see, believes those wars may not have been necessary. When a person with that level of experience and personal sacrifice steps forward and warns that the same mistakes could be happening again, it is not something you brush aside. It is something you seriously reflect on. So now I want to hear from you. What is your take on all of this? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to like and subscribe. And I will catch you in the next video.